Once upon a time, on Twitter, a brilliant artist named Meg Frank spoke their desires to the internet. And because this desire was a great idea and would make people happy, their friends and an institution of higher learning made it come true, adjusted for availability. Welcome to the Sparkle Salon, where a group of multifaceted writers and scientists get to be as wonky as they want about their research, their work, and anything else they feel like talking about. And you get to listen in. Enjoy.
This is the traditional way that we start meetings among our people.
Yes.
So
I
this
want
is,
to reach through the screen.
I know there's so, this is Infrared, who she really likes to lick faces and bite fingers. And she's an adventurer. Bye.
Oh,
Her sister's Ultraviolet, and she has a
good
purple collar.
name.
Yes, they're the spectral kitties, and I'm really enjoying having them around. So what should we talk about, Malka?
Well, let's start just by saying for the record that we really miss having Amal here, but
Yeah.
not able to make it today. So hopefully on the next one.
Yeah. And then we can also say Happy New Year because
We
we
can.
are indeed recording this on the start of 2024 and may it be marvelous.
Yes. Someone said it's such a science fictional ass year, which I like the phrase because, yeah, it kind of is when you think about it. All the 1980s science fiction is set now.
Yeah.
And are we properly going into the age of Aquarius now as well from the science to the non-scientific?
I feel like I should like grab my friend CL Polk, who's way better at astrology than me, but I think it like happens like mid-year or something.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Really? Oh, this year really is like the
this year really.
dawning of the age of Aquarius. Wow. We could use it.
What is that supposed to mean exactly? I'm an astronomer, so I don't know anything about astrology. What is Age of Aquarius supposed to mean?
I think it's just a happy time, right? Like I only know
That's what the
based
song
on-
implies.
Yeah,
Okay.
I only know
But
the
is
song
it-
from Hair.
Is it based on some kind of like
Fake.
alignment or something? Like
Yeah, so okay, I'm gonna get this horribly wrong, which will be entertaining at least. Because I'm like astrology adjacent to people who do this much better than me, but a whole lot of planets move where they are in constellations this year, and some of them are like the really, really outer planets that they don't move very often from one constellation to another one because of the way you do a star chart. So I think it's like Pluto moves into the house of Aquarius, which is like a slice of the sky. You divide the sky into 12. And that means that the spirit of Aquarius is upon the generation of people that are now. I start sounding like I'm speaking in apocalyptic text. Like,
so do astrologers still count Pluto as a planet?
yeah.
I mean, you know, at least somebody is, right? Like it seems nice that Pluto still has a fan club. Like
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. They're all arbitrary categories. It doesn't really matter in any way what you call a particular chunk of rock. I'm just curious about like what the classifications are, because like
I think they
constellations
have to.
as defined by astrologers are totally different in lots of ways than the way that astronomers think about this stuff.
also I've read in a couple of places that now all of the astrological signs are wrong anyway because everything has moved since in the last couple thousand years since they were first codified in the West. So I mean, we're
Yes.
working
I think
obviously
so,
with the
yeah.
Western constellations. In fact, not just Western, but like the Northern Hemisphere, right? So I love the Southern constellations that have like, don't they have like the iron or like the drill press or something like that? They have really great.
I don't know, but there are some that have they're based on not on the stars, but on like the darknesses between the stars. Like basically, it's like, so there are within the Milky Way, there are dark clouds that are just like dust clouds, and they create sort of dark blotches in the Milky Way. And in the southern hemisphere, because you're looking at the center of the Milky Way, you have a much bigger sort of bright area in one part of the sky, and so the dark clouds are like a little bit more prominent, especially if you're in a really dark sky. And so there are some constellations that are based on the shapes in those clouds. So there's, excuse me, in indigenous Australian cultures, there some of them have a constellation that's an emu sort of lying across the sky, and it's based on the dark clouds. Like there's a dark cloud that's the head of the emu, and then there's the body, and based on like the orientation of the Milky Way across the sky, the emu might be standing up or lying down, and it's correlated with like the life cycle of the emus is going through like the mating periods and stuff like that. It's really fascinating.
Wow.
I love that.
Yeah, it makes more sense than a kind of connect the dots, see if you can see a giant here kind of approach.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it is. Yeah, there's and they're kind of, it's just there are some really interesting like connections between the timekeeping connected to the natural world in terms of the animals, and then the pictures in the sky, which are often animals. So it's very cool.
Reading
Negative
Hild
space
right now.
constellations.
Have you read Hild?
Sorry?
Have any of you read Hild? Yeah, sure.
Yes,
no,
I
no,
have.
I haven't.
By Nicola Griffith, which
It's so awesome.
Not yet.
amazing. And the new one came out this year, so that's why I'm rereading. But it's set in the 700s, I think. Is that right, Annalee?
Yeah, I
And-
think so. Yeah.
and it's about this woman. Well, it starts when she's a girl, and she's just very smart and intuitive and picks up languages and makes connections, and so becomes a seer. But so much of the way she thinks is based on sort of natural processes and what the animals are doing. And the way that Nicola writes is just incredible.
Yeah.
And so you're very much in the head of this like child who has a totally different perspective on the world, and yet uses it in a way that feels very familiarly modern in terms of drawing connections and manipulating people and small nations. And it's brilliant. So anyway, I'm very happy to be rereading it right now. And that reminded me of it because it's very much like just the observations of the way things function, replicating across different areas of nature.
I love her writing so much.
I really need to read this.
It's
There's
really
like systems processing as a sort of method of divination, like just the way you described it, and that all of the little lights in my brain go off.
yeah, reading character. And it's very interesting to think about that compared to the way we do, like, because she talks about it in relation to the kinds of divination that were done then, but also thinking about the way we do divination now in our ways. And it's really a fascinating thing to read.
Also, there's like a whole subplot in Hild about how literacy is a weapon.
Yes.
And like learning to read and write is basically like learning a code. And it's how she becomes powerful, because she's able to communicate across distances using the power of literacy. And because she's a great politician, basically. And I just was like, yes, of course. Like if you were just learning about literacy, it would feel like a technology, not like just an everyday thing that everybody does. It's like generative AI, except your brain is generating it.
Must we, Annalee?
I'm sorry. Yeah. Can we just 2024
Every
no more
single
AI?
I mean, it seems like all the signs are there to stop talking about it, and yet.
Hang on. I want to backtrack a little. So, Malka, when you raised Hild and you started to describe this character, at first, the direction I thought you were going in was to talk about how, especially for seers, ritual can have almost like a placebo type effect, in the sense that, you bring the human expectations and imaginations into it. And it started me thinking, we were talking about Age of Aquarius and the expectations for that. I know they've researched placebo effect on individuals, in terms of health outcomes and whatever. I wonder if anyone's ever done it for collectives, for cultures, for like a group, where, as in, I mean, I'm sure politicians must do research or try to find research to see how well their propaganda works, for example. And is there a setup or a scenario where they can say, we wanted this entire group or population to move in this particular positive direction, so we created this kind of environment to see if we could get them there?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. The thing that came into my mind first when you're talking about placebo effect is really more of a nocebo effect politically of like people thinking that the economy is terrible and inflation is out of control and unemployment is out of control and all of these things, and crime is way high. When at the moment, if you look at all those markers, the trend is better for most people and not for everybody, and that's where it gets complicated. But like that feels like a really big nocebo effect somehow. But it's just like I don't know, it's probably just propaganda, as you said, like using like politicians using propaganda to affect people, how the way people feel. I don't know examples of people doing it like positively. Yeah.
I've seen some actually, but they're harder to do positively because like I guess I've never conceived of this as using the terms placebo or nocebo, like the public health terms. Mostly, I think of it as like the original meaning of like a viral meme, like a cultural meme that is something that people pass to each other, like a virus. A way of thinking, a worldview that is in some way infectious or attractive. And there are positive ones, but they tend to be harder to maintain, I think. Or at least right now they do. And that might have something to do with algorithms and attention economy and like clicks for outrage, because that's easy. But I think it is a thing that happens. Like people collectively come to a mood.
So is government a placebo?
For what?
Is government a placebo? Like, is the belief in government, like, is that kind of like, like it's a way of getting people to work collaboratively sometimes when it's a way of like, marshaling human power. Is that
I think like nation is a kind of placebo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Does stuff. I mean, it might not do everything that it says it's doing, but
wait, do we want to use the word placebo like that though? Because when I was talking about it, I literally meant in terms of creating a positive mood. Like here is I mean, in a way you're using it like here is a pill that works, even if it's a sugar pill. So you're basically saying government doesn't really work, but we're going to make you pretend really hard that it does, and maybe it will.
Yeah. So it is.
I mean, as the person who works inside government, I would say hopefully not. But I don't like that was why I asked Annalee, a placebo for what? Because for me, when I think about placebo, it's you have an effect that is a replacement effect, that there's no active chemical causing pain relief or improving someone's outcome. But there could be, like you could cause this effect with a chemical or an intervention. And instead you're using something else. So
that, okay, so government sometimes, yes, but I do think that the idea of nationhood is a placebo for creating identity where none existed. And there's been some work on this. There's a concept called foundational fictions, and I want to make sure I get the name right of the person who wrote about this, which looks at, Doris Sommer is the academic who wrote about this, specifically in the context of Latin America, where colonized countries were creating their identities with often sort of these national stories of like Martin Fierro in Argentina and other stories about like, this is who we are.
Mhm.
It creates this somewhat communal identity out of saying like, we believe we have a communal identity.
Yeah.
The example that comes to my mind about a placebo effect on large scales is, I mean, and people have different opinions about this, but religion has been literally called the opiate of the masses, right? And so, like, in a very direct comparison. So, like, I think religiosity can certainly, you know, in a lot of cases, does sort of make people happier about their circumstances in ways that can be very exploitative sometimes, in other ways that can be just purely helpful sometimes.
Like
So
therapeutic.
yeah. So I think, but it is something that has been exploited to keep people oppressed by, you know, making them think like, oh, it's okay, it'll be better in the afterlife. In
This is a
certain
good point you're
circumstances.
raising here, because there's a difference between the kind of positive mood that makes you feel like, oh, I don't have to do anything, things will be better, or things actually are okay, and the kind of positive mood that says, oh, I can actually do something and it will have an effect. I can actually do something. This is kind of fascinating, because I think that I'm going to unscientifically narrow my definition of placebo to mean the kind of thing that makes people feel positive about being active, not being passive, not being kind of like, oh well, you know, this is just the way it is, but literally feeling like I can go and try this thing, do this thing, whatever, that will make not just my situation better, but my entire community situation better, because I believe I'm in the kind of world where this thing can happen and can have positive results.
So
Yeah.
empowerment or motivation.
Empowerment or motivation, yeah.
Education.
I still think that if we're going to work with placebo, we have to think about what is it replacing, and what is it actually an intervention? Because I mean, I definitely see where you're going, Katie, when you're talking about like religion as an anesthetic to difficult and painful questions. But also I would say that that's not a replacement for an intervention. Religion is in and of itself an actual intervention. Like it's not, there's no sense of something could be here but isn't.
Well,
and instead,
Isn't it a replacement
it-
for like family
Yeah.
connections or clan or
well,
something like that?
it can vary a lot. I mean, when I was
Yeah,
studying
wow.
when I was studying theology, one of the things we were reading about was liberation theology, and this idea that like if you're there, you know, sort of theological arguments can be used to help improve people's situations, but also can be used to convince people that they don't need to improve their situations because they're going to be okay in the afterlife, and you know, they should just be pious and not actually like free themselves, you know. And so there's that kind of so I think it can be used to specifically negate action or discourage action, but it can also be, you know, used in positive. I don't want to say bad things about religiosity.
Yeah, no, that's not. I think I'm just having trouble with like the definitions we're using, because I guess I associate like placebo with and this is a gross generalization, placebo with a false or non-existent solution, which nevertheless has the effect. So to me, there's always like, if we're going to talk about a placebo, what is the placebo for? Like, what would be the real thing? And that's where I'm running into trouble with some of the ideas of treating religion as a placebo. What is it a placebo for? Is it a placebo for
so
action?
maybe we shouldn't run with this too far, because it was a very off the cuff, let's call this a placebo effect thing I said. But you have said something that I do find interesting and that I'd like to dig down into a little deeper. When you think about how a placebo works, especially let's say for pain, okay, a placebo, painkiller placebo, the idea there, I think, is that the body itself produces what is necessary to lower the pain levels. So in a way, you are tricking the mind into making the body release the same chemicals that the externally taken pill would have taken. So if you did want to extend the metaphor, then it would be a case of creating a positive mood to make people create the solution that is needed, because they actually believe a solution can be created.
Okay, I see where you're going now. That does make a lot of sense.
It's basically, yeah, the placebo is a kind of reveals to us that we never needed an external solution to begin with. We didn't need to pay the pharmaceutical company to help us, you know, have
No,
this
wait, this is going
healthy
wrong.
response.
This is going back in the
Sorry,
other direction.
I'm just saying, I'm playing with the metaphor. I'm just like placing the metaphor in the context of contemporary capitalism.
Their medications.
No, not
at
at all. I'm not at all, but it's like, I'm just saying that that's one way to think about it, is like that this is something that people are, that's why this metaphor of placebo is different from propaganda, right? Because it's like, the idea is like, oh, it turns out we didn't need the propaganda. We had it in us all along to form a community, to change things. We didn't need, you know, an external force that's being marketed to us, you know, in the modern sense, right? Not in the ancient sense. So yeah, I love that. I think that's a really interesting, it's a very chewy metaphor. I can see it going in a lot of interesting ways.
Like there is that really important slice of like something that helps you get past whatever block there is on getting things together. And on the other hand, the sort of opiate angle, because I was thinking, the example I was thinking of before was voting as like the only thing you have to do to say, okay, as long as everyone goes out and votes, we're a democracy and that's fine. Which
feels very real right now.
Yeah, which I'm not to say don't vote, like please vote, but please don't think that that's all there is in terms of forming community or creating change or you know, these other things, or protesting the bad things that are happening. So I think, you know, that is, and voting, it's important. It's not quite a placebo, because we need that function. That is the mechanism that we have for accountability and participation. But is it also something that becomes that stand-in and becomes that opiate where people don't have to then go to the next step?
I mean, this sort of makes me think that someday we'll figure out how to have public meetings that aren't awful, and then maybe it will be easier to get people to come to them. But as
if you feed them, they will come.
Yeah, but the public meeting itself is still terrible. Like, it is my least favorite way of doing what a phrase I hate, but which is the term of art, which is stakeholder outreach. And we have to go talk to people. It's really important. And I want people to show up and tell me, as someone who's making a policy, what they think it should be like, and what would be useful to them. But the public meeting, the only people who come to public meetings are people who can get there and make the time. So that tends to, even when we schedule them online and in multiple places, it tends to be people who have free time. So less often people who need to take care of children, people who need to take care of elders, people who have jobs that don't have flexible schedules. So there's a whole group of people who are disinclined to participate. And then the process itself of participating, both from the policymaker side and from my experiences of going to them as a quote unquote constituent, more words I hate, is like shouting into a void, or having people shout at a void that's near you. Like that is the policymaker side. It feels like you're sitting there and you've made something like a draft policy, and then people come and they shout at a void that's like next to you. And the void is what they think the policy says.
I'm really seeing this graphic of you sitting at the table with like this swirling void.
Shadow.
Yeah. And it is like a shadow. It's like, if we're going to be Jungian about the policy, it's the policy's horrible shadow self is always what the people come to shout at. So I don't know how to make the public meeting better. But I also don't know how to ask people to tell me what they think if it's not, hey, here it is, come tell me about it.
Yeah.
What's the best public meeting that you've ever been to? Like, what did that look like? What did that feel like? there has to be a best.
There is, but it's like, so it did not produce the effect that anyone of the public at the public meeting intended the public meeting to have.
Okay.
As if it lost all of its structure. There was no, here's a bunch of speakers who came up to have their say. It was something that very quickly devolved into a bunch of people talking, just very casually. It's also a fairly small number, which is significant, because it wouldn't have gone that way had it not been something that was sort of dissolvable. Like it had an initial structure, and that structure quickly, because people spoke to the person who was giving the public comment, other people who had come to share their opinions, and also because I wasn't running this one, but the person I was with who was willing to also break that line of, I'm just going to sit here and say nothing, which is how, at least in urban planning training in America, we are trained to do it, that we can't respond, that we're just supposed to sit there, which is not helpful. Was willing to sort of break that and join a conversation. But did that public meeting actually come to any conclusions about what the town sustainability plan? No. Did the people there build a community more than they had before? Probably yes. But we had to do it again the quote unquote right way to get them the funding to like replace bits of their infrastructure.
It's interesting that, I mean, it sounds like the meeting did serve a purpose, like in that it had what we were talking about, that placebo effect of like creating a sense of community. And it's also interesting to think about the small group dynamic versus the kind of more formal dynamic. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm teaching a university class next semester for the first time in like decades. And I was like, oh, I'm going to break the students into small groups sometimes and have a larger group discussion at other times. And I kind of just had this thought in the back of my mind that like, yeah, it's different somehow when they talk in little groups versus big groups. But I think that's like that kind of sums up like what I was kind of grasping towards, like blindly. It's like, yeah, you can form communities better and like have, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like you guys did have a good conversation that like led to a better meeting later.
The things that were discussed were things that did get partially reflected in revisions to that plan, but it's this tension constantly between professionalized systems of causing things to happen and community expression of what a community actually needs to happen. And those two languages are really bad at talking to each other, but you can't pick just one or just the other one. In my experience, which is limited, and I work for a state government, so like I have biases here, but, and my biases lead me to, I love having the conversation where we all sit around and like think at the problem. But eventually I have to write a grant application, otherwise nothing will happen.
Yeah. I mean,
will it make any sense to have a person who acts almost like as a mediator in that sort of situation? Because if you're not allowed to speak up, as it were, in the usual meeting, but you also have to deal with the shadow policy that people are misunderstanding and yelling at, and well, misunderstanding, creating, and then yelling at. If you have like a third party who's like a neutral observer / mediator / recorder of what is going on, is that a middle ground that is of use to anybody, or the structure just doesn't exist for that?
I've seen it work. I've more often seen it create a third layer of obfuscation, but when it works, it's amazing.
Okay.
So I don't have experience in like government meetings and things like this, but I feel like there's a dynamic that that I see online all the time that sounds like it's a kind of similar thing, which is that if you feel passionately about something and you want to persuade and there's an audience, then like all of the social pressure is to not listen to anything anybody else is saying and to be right, and I feel like if you get up at a podium in front of a large number of people and you have to tell your case, that's a situation where it's very, very hard to listen to anything, and it's very hard to compromise or be open to ideas. And I mean, this is why I think arguments on the internet never work, is because that, especially arguments on social media among people who have audiences, right? Like you just, everybody is playing for their audience, and then you get things like quote tweets and big fights, and it's just, I don't think that's, I think that it's just very, very hard to be open to discussion in that context, because of the audience and because you're coming in already with the goal of persuasion. Whereas if you're in a small group and you're just kind of talking, then yeah, you do get that sense of community, but you also have the possibility of, maybe being persuaded, changing your mind, having some compromise without losing, your standing as, the truth teller in this large group.
These meetings are not always about persuasion. Sometimes they are this consultation, like really, and I have definitely been in meetings of non-governmental organizations where we would go and be like, so what do you need done here? And they'd be like, I'm thinking of one specific meeting where the people like, just do what you're going to do. You're the NGO, you came here, you have money to do a thing, just do it, stop asking us stuff. And, on the one hand, very understandable. But I think there is this, there's this very valid feeling that we should have participation and buy-in. And then there's this other equally valid feeling of like, it's a pain in the ass, and a lot of it is not going to be listened to anyway, based on previous experience, and which may or may not be true in an individual case.
So trust is definitely a factor, isn't it?
Trust is definitely a factor.
Very much.
Time is a huge factor. Understanding the parameters, which probably, in the case of your grant writing and NGO, also very grant dependent, like there's a whole set of rules that come from somewhere else that are fairly arcane. But also the other thing I wanted to say is that whole professional thing of getting things done, and generally our sort of ideas about having systems in society, which are good things for lots of reasons, they put a lot of emphasis on sort of doing the same thing everywhere and having like the cookie cutter template. And I think, when you're talking about communities, especially deciding critical things like infrastructure or disaster assistance or stuff that, has an impact for a while, it's really, they're so different. Like there's just so much variety in terms of where community is when you get to it, and, how much elite capture there is, and what, whether they're used to participating in certain ways or not. And it's just always very different in terms of what you need to do. And it is super hard to have people who can adapt in that way, while still, again, you have to have that reflection back to either grants or reports or something where you're saying, we did this in a fairly standardized way. There was no favoritism. We have all these structures to say we should do things the same way so that we don't on the scale. But every person in community is very different. So yeah, it's really tricky.
Yeah,
The
it's like
thing that
bureaucracy.
I wish...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
As I say, it's like bureaucracy is this very codified community, and then there's human communities that come in every kind of shape. And so that's why we then build another layer of like community bureaucracy in between the two things, and you have people like Malka going out and being, workers on the ground and performing that role. And so I think what we want is maybe some way to have that organic community and that synthetic community of bureaucracy be a little bit more able to adapt to each other.
I would settle for being able to speak a mutually intelligible language.
Yeah.
And honestly, like the best thing that I could think of, if I could like rewrite my agency's budget and have like everything for me, like I get to pick, which is so not the case, I would hire a person in every town we work with.
Yeah.
From that town who lives there, and not full-time maybe, but part-time, just like as like the speaker to governments.
Yes.
And I mean, that person's going to get things wrong about their own community, and they may not be the most representative person, but at least they'd be from there. At least they'd be somewhat embedded.
Yeah.
Because like that kind of creation of intelligible common language is very difficult to do when you can't see into the community from the bureaucracy side. And I think from the community side, it becomes like the bureaucracy only speaks in jargon, as if we're like some kind of billboard. And honestly, that's kind of true in a lot of cases. So I don't know, I wish we had more like cultural liaisons.
I really think, I mean, when I try to think of solutions for this, you talked about how a lot of people don't have the resources to attend these meetings, but also on your side, there are not enough resources for what they're asking you to do in a
Oh God, no.
Right. And
Yeah,
I mean,
we have
just thinking about
I am
this
the only
part of
person in my
participation.
Yeah, that's why it's important in this like fantasy model that we're coming up with, that person who's embedded in the community gets paid, because then
Yes.
like they're, it's a way of showing respect, because we live in a capitalist society and that is how we show respect. And it is also a way of freeing up their time so that they actually can come to these meetings and, not feel like they're unable to pay for childcare or,
And I
pay
really
for their
think
lives.
the full spectrum of what's happening. Like, yes, they should be paid. They should also have a budget for, as you said, Karen, food and and space and all
Travel,
these things. And like
childcare.
meetings
Yeah.
should probably be many, many more times, not in the sense of like everyone has to go to more meetings, but we're going to have a lot of meetings so the people who can't make it at one time can come to another, and so that they can be smaller. And, just like every level of the system should be coming from a place of more abundance. And yeah, I know
It's so hard to argue for abundance.
yeah, and
Like
it just you feel like
that's such a huge thing.
people are doing these things because they're supposed to, but they aren't willing to put the resources to do it properly. And I was just seeing, I know we don't want to talk about large language models, but I was just saw the one about like that they're going to be reading student essays for college applications.
They already do.
Yeah, I'm sure they already do. And even before they did, the people who have to read those, I'm sure they have so many to read and so many other responsibilities that they can't give it actually the attention they need. Plus, I'm sure it's a really horrible job to read essay after essay of, poor kids who have been told, show that you've done this and that and blah, blah, but also, it's a terrible measurement, but there's a huge reason to have a measurement, which is not a standardized test.
Yeah.
This is an attempt for that. And there should be ways to do it. But if you're not going to put the resources to either people, reading them and having time and like, if you're not going to treat them like something that is not a standardized test, what's the point? And there's so many things I think in our society that institutions and organizations and governments do to say, oh, we did it, but they don't actually put the resources to do it in a way that makes it in any way meaningful.
It reminds
What you said about
I was
go first.
just gonna make a joke that pretty soon it's gonna be the essays are written by ChatGPT and then read by ChatGPT, and there's no human involved at any point in the process.
And quite honestly, like
it's whitewashing all the way down.
Yeah. To me, if an essay can be written by ChatGPT, it wasn't a good essay prompt. Like, why are we asking one to do this if it can be written by a soulless large language model
equally if it can be read by it?
What it ought to say. That's not a useful measure of the academic ability or possible future of a student. If that can be reproduced by ChatGPT, we're asking the wrong question.
Also,
That's
it's
a very,
not
very good point.
it's worse than a soulless model, right? Like it's a model built on like the dead souls of like a million authors, right? It's like literally dead labor. It's just
Too vivid, too vivid.
yeah, it's like it's
possible.
but that's what I but it, that's why it's like it's so much worse. Like it's, you know, it's
It is. It's
you
not.
don't get it's resource
Like,
extraction.
I almost want to use like the good horror metaphors that you were using, Annalee, like well, it is the dead souls of all of this writing, all like composite and reanimated, but that gives it too much credit. That really does, because having it is composed of extracted labor. That one I like. But if we talk about it as like a reanimated corpse, that already is too interesting. That already says they're like valuable.
Well, you have to
At least
admit
to
there
me,
is
as someone
something
who-
yeah, there is something interesting about it though. Like the reason why people are excited about ChatGPT is it is exciting and interesting. Generative AI, not in the realm of writing essays, is also helpful and interesting. So but it also has this tragic core and is based on, you know, oppression and thievery, not the good kind of thievery, not privateering.
Oh.
And so I think, I don't know, I think it's, I don't know, I guess I don't feel like I need to fight ChatGPT by saying that it's boring and useless, although I agree that it is. But I also think there is a horror to it. I think it's important for people to remember that it is made up of other humans. Like, because one of the myths about it, right, is that like, oh, it's like a cyborg that like is, you know, just cyborg ex machina. And it's like, no, it's actually, it's people. It's made of human thought.
Soylent
and like,
Green is, etc.
yeah, it's, and I think, yeah, the horror of that people should think about that when they use it. Like whose labor has been stolen to let me write this, you know?
Right. So the way I got introduced to the Chat GPT thing is a friend of mine who I have lots of cool conversations with, plugged my name in and showed me what it wrote as my bio, which really gave me a little frisson of horror, because it was like I had these echoes of interviews I'd done, so I could actually kind of sense and see where they'd scraped certain information from, and it wasn't accurate. It wasn't fully accurate. So I could also see where the deviations happened, and it reminded me of every so often I have a look at my Pinterest again, and suddenly I saw a proliferation of AI generated images of, you know, various things like, oh, here's a cool studio, here's whatever. And at first I didn't know what I was looking at. I would just look at this image and I would be like, I feel profoundly disturbed on some level and I can't figure out why. And I'd stared at it and stared at it, and then I'd be like, the staircase doesn't go anywhere. There's a landing and there's a staircase. They don't actually connect. They go from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions in this weird way, and there's not an actual landing for someone to go up these stairs and step off. And then I actually became furious because it feels like being gaslit. It feels like your brain is trying to make these logical connections, and then there's this gap. But because we are accustomed to looking at things or listening to things or reading things and taking in a lot of information really quickly, when there's that kind of, oh, everything's fine, and then this significant gap in terms of logical connection or what makes sense, and our brain can't immediately find it, but understands that something about the whole picture is just wrong. How do people like not look at that and go mad on a daily basis? I find it so frustrating.
No, it's really uncanny valley. Like the thing that they say about the visual of robots is there, but like mentally. And I went to you know, I try to keep track of what people are saying about my book as one does. So I went and Google and searched the name of my book on the site that, you know, I'm not actually using anymore, but I want to know what's going on. And so I looked, and there was someone had written this long sort of review that was very positive. And then there were all these replies. And all the replies were like echoes of each other, but just changed a little bit. You know, like it was the creepiest freaking thing.
Yeah.
It was horrific. And I went to the original account that did the review, and it was all this, like all these reviews of books that I don't know if I don't know if it's a person. I don't know if they wrote the original review, but the replies are clearly all just bots like picking out words and sentences from the review and sort of patching them together. And it gave me this memory of when I once, for a job, visited a plantation for making paper in Sumatra. And we drove for hours and hours in this forest that was full of trees, and they were all the same tree. Some of them were taller and some of them were smaller, but they were all exactly the same shape. And it was the creepiest fucking thing ever. And this felt just like that. It was this uncanny way of, here's a thing that should be, that should have a lot of difference and a lot of texture. And it's not quite all the same, but it is actually all the same. And it is it's horrifying.
There's something, and I wish that we had like a linguistics philosopher for a minute, like if I could summon one at will. There's something about what large language models and generative AI, especially in images, do to the relationship between signifier and sign, which is really, really awful. Because there's this, to me, there's this sense of cutting them free of each other, a kind of slippage. And the trees are all the same, the comments are all the same, and they're not there for a reason. There's no motivation behind them. But they imitate a signifier. So it's like all signifier, no sign, and the sign is other. And that's the sense of gaslit. Like the sign is, I wanted a lot of comments, so I paid for these bots.
Yes.
Not, and that like every time I run into that, it feels like some very foundational beliefs that I have grown up with about the nature of communication are disturbed. And they don't feel disturbed for a useful reason. And that's part of why I get so annoyed with this stuff. Like, I think like I'm annoyed instead of being horrified, because annoyed I can do something with. But it feels like poison in language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to do another little thing from Hild, because the other thing that really struck me just now when I was reading it was, so this girl, who's this like young teenage girl, goes to a big market town for the first time. And she's wandering around. She's like, you can buy this, you can buy that. There's all these things here. There's swords. You can buy swords, because in her world, swords are given to people who have earned them. Right. And she's like, what? They're selling them. And it's like this shift in worldview of, where you're, and the previous state is also not perfect, because as we actually see in the book, though it's not emphasized much, you can be in a situation where you just don't have a liege lord who wants to give you a sword for one reason or another, and then you get kind of stuck, right? But this shift between something that you earn to something that can be bought.
Yes.
And it just hit really powerfully right now, because I think we're seeing that transition. I mean, it's obviously already happened throughout the vast majority of our society, but we're seeing it happen in some places that we had hoped it hadn't yet.
Yeah, it's like language in sort of what you were saying, Arkady, made me think about how when we talk about content versus communication, and like, what is that content? It's like the packing peanuts of communication. It's just sort of there to like fill in the gaps or something. And it's also, instead of language being use value, it's exchange value, right? Like all we're doing is just like, we're using it to like get something, or to produce an account on X that has enough followers that it can be monetized or something like that, right? Like there's always this hope for cash or some kind of, value that's going to come out of it that has nothing to do with actually saying anything to anyone else about a book or anything. So yeah, it is really peculiar to have writing turn into something that's like not writing. It's not being used as writing. It's being used just as like a a
All
symbol
signifier.
of it's being used as like a symbol for community. Like, oh, look, there's people here. And it's like, but no, there's no people here.
It's just robots talking to each other, and they're not.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, like, I say that as if the robots could actually hear, but they cannot hear. They only talk.
Yeah, it's
There's
packing
no-
peanuts. Like
Yeah,
they're like
packing peanuts
interlocking
don't
with each
talk.
other, but
Yeah.
yeah.
That
It reminds me.
uncanny, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say that uncanny valley thing is really that's really sort of crystallized it in my mind. Like and I it reminds me of a few like science fiction stories I've read in which some alien thing or some mind altering thing is trying to create a sort of simulacrum of humanity in one way or another, to manipulate someone or you know, to trap someone, and there's that creepy aspect. And it's very much you know, when you read a bunch of text written by a chat bot, like you really get that sense of that sort of specific kind of horror. It's very well
Empty
done,
rooms
you know.
talking to other empty rooms.
Yeah.
Like there's no people there. There's no there.
And it is specifically to manipulate you, right? Like
Yeah.
it's all just the manipulation part, not the connection part. I think is the part that is what's so creepy about it, is that it's just got that purpose of making you do something or making you think something or you know, misleading you in some way, but there's no, I mean, the beautiful thing about language is that you can connect people through the thoughts in your head, right? Like it's you know, you can share a deep intimacy with another person just through language by sharing thoughts, and that's something that we can't do with any other species really, that we rarely see other species really do with amongst themselves, and to take that and then to sort of pervert it in this way to be pure manipulation. I mean, I know language is used to manipulate in a lot of ways, but like to take all of the connection out of it is upsetting.
Yeah, I want like a real person behind my propaganda, like some devious, like
Gotta do
brilliant
the
thinker,
work.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've been
I'd
hearing
go farther
the
than
phrase
upsetting.
monetize. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I was just going to say, I was going to go farther than upsetting and say obscene. But because that's kind of how I interact with it. Like, this is not a thing that should be, but which is not to say that I don't think that large language models aren't interesting, or that generative AI isn't interesting, because I do, and I think there are uses for it that are fascinating and great. It is this particular use case. So anyway, sorry, Karen.
No, it just connecting back to what I'm hearing a lot of you saying. I keep hearing the word monetize, and I'm beginning to feel like every time I hear that word, I can expect nonsense to happen. It's like the love of money is the root of all evil. It's actually true. And I'm trying to figure out you know, how we kind of got to this place where everybody's like desperate to be able to use that term, you know, monetize. I'm going to monetize this, I'm going to monetize that, whatever. And you know, I keep thinking back to what Malka said about resources and time, and understanding that people have to eat and people need childcare and so on and so forth. And a lot of the desperation that people have that makes them want to monetize this and monetize that is because we don't have things in place that allow us to feel confident and comfortable and stable about the basics of our lives, where the sort of the there's no safety net that we feel we can trust anymore. And I think that turns us into that turns us into people looking for, in a way, the wrong things. You're really looking for security, you're really looking for stability, you're really looking for a certain level of freedom and whatever, but we're just looking at the method, which is the money, and focusing on that and over focusing on that. And then, of course, the way the world works in many ways, in some countries more than others, there's this idea that you have to have a massive buffer of additional money, because even just having a certain amount is no guarantee. Like, supposing you get sick tomorrow, supposing you lose your job tomorrow, and then all of a sudden you're right back down to square one again. It's a snakes and ladders game on a particularly horrible sort of scale. And I don't know what the answers are to that, because we're almost like trauma reacting, a sense of scarcity, and not only a sense of scarcity, but almost a sense of manufactured scarcity, because even if we do have the basics, there's going to be somebody to come along and propagandize us, brainwash us into believing that we don't have a good life, that we need to be more popular, or we need to have these clothes, or we need to. And then once you create the scarcity mentality again, you can get people to either chase a monetizing dream, or buy into something, or try shares in something, or look for the new disruptive technology. I mean, we're going through this over and over again. NFTs, what happened exactly to them?
Yeah, I think you're right. And
the same thing that happened to tulips is what happened to NFTs.
Yes.
Thank you. It's a tulip thing over again. It just keeps repeating.
But at least tulips are actually like
pretty.
They exist.
But I think you're right on a lot of the monetization thing, but I think there's also this other layer of people who do it because they want this kind of status or prestige in a cheap way. Because a lot of the people who are talking about, I'm just going to have AI write this book for me because I have this idea and it's a great idea. And like, yes, they probably want to get rich quick, but I also feel like there's this, I want to have published a book, right? And it's interesting, as we were talking about it before, in terms of, people sort of paying for something. That has been happening. Like, it is not actually new, because we've had ghostwritten celebrity books of various kinds for a long time. And, this idea that people would publish a book that often doesn't actually say anything.
Malka, what you were saying reminds me of the blue check fiasco, right?
Yeah.
Like that was something that had nothing to do with money really, but it was a symbol of influence, and people who didn't have it wanted it. And I mean that was the first step in what brought down Twitter, I guess. But something so meaningless really, or valueless really, that nobody paid for. But because there was this sense that like, I have to have that influence, I have to have that symbol of importance, people wanted to be able to do that. And then it turned into kind of the opposite of what it was in some ways, and then the whole thing fell apart in a horrible
after it was monetized.
Yeah.
It was monetized, and then it became meaningless.
Yeah. This is what gives me a little bit of hope, actually, about the whole generative AI and endless chatbots talking to each other forever, is because humans do notice meaninglessness. And they actually do not like it terribly much. As a collective, people notice that something has become robbed of its previous signifying status. And the people who don't notice or who don't care tend to be a relatively small portion of the community. See, under the fall of Twitter, it is still in process, but the great majority of people who were using Twitter for functionality, as opposed to using Twitter for status or propaganda, have left, or no longer make use of it in a substantive way. And I am beginning to see this with the proliferation of AI and generated answers in search engines, that people just stop using them. And I think that will continue. So for all that I find the whole thing terrifying, I also think that as humans, we have a pretty decent immune system to it once it gets to a certain level, that we really don't like it as a society, as people who communicate at all. Eventually you pull away from it because it doesn't do anything. And I'm going to have to make that my dramatic last statement, because I am in my office and I have to go to another meeting, which is dreadful because you guys are way more fun than what I have to do next.
It's so nice to see you all again.
Yeah, it was super fun.
Really good. Yeah. I feel like we could go on for several hours, but
oh yeah.
New Year, everyone. Take care.
Right. Happy New
And
Year,
have a
guys.
happy age of Aquarius, and
again.
let's seize the placebo positivity and vote and change the world for the better.
Yes.
Excellent. All
Sounds
right.
good.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year. Thanks, everyone.